Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Good morning. Welcome to the Open Door. Jim Hannock here with John Brain, and we want to be open to the Holy Spirit. We want to be open to you, our listeners. And we're going to begin with a short prayer. Direct, we beseech thee, all our actions by thy holy inspirations, and carry them on by thy gracious assistance, that every prayer and work of ours may begin always from thee and by thee be happily ended. Amen.
Amen.
This morning we have a two-part agenda. In the first part, we'd like to look at Catholic thought on disarmament, nuclear disarmament. And to do so, we're going to look at a recent statement from the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. Now, this statement is a background statement. It's an informational statement. I want to mention in passing to the listeners that if you are interested in taking a good look at any Catholic teaching in the ethical context, political context, intersection of the two, you might very well want to go to the website of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. It's a very rich source of documents, various statements, background pieces like the background piece that we're looking at today. And after a time, also, we're going to check in with how candidates from the American Solidarity Party, a party based really on Catholic social teaching, how those candidates are doing here in California. I'm speaking to you from California. John is coming from Illinois. But because I'm speaking from California, I'm aware of how these candidates are doing. And it's just possible that one of them will join us when you're out on the hustings, as they say, not to mention trying to earn your daily bread, 8 o'clock in the morning, and that's the time it is here in Southern California, isn't always the greatest of times. Well, John, I'd like to begin at the end of this document from the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. I think you've had a chance to look at it. At the end, we have action requested in all caps. I'd like to read through that action requested, and prompted by the action, go back to the backgrounder that the Conference of Catholic Bishops has provided. I'm doing that because the backgrounder is pretty detailed, at least for this sort of genre, pretty detailed, and this will help us to connect with it at strategic points. I'm reading now from action requested. Number 1, urge bold and concrete commitments to accelerate verifiable nuclear disarmament, including taking weapons off launch on warning status to prevent a catastrophic accident, and making deeper cuts in nuclear arsenals. Maybe, John, you could comment, if you recall it wasn't very long ago at all, this scare, genuine scare in the state of Hawaii with regard to incoming missiles. This is not a test, incoming missiles.
Yeah, I heard a little bit about that some time ago, that there was a false alarm in the state of Hawaii, and it got everybody scared, and everyone thought that they were going to be wiped off the face of the earth in a matter of minutes. In regards to this statement here, I'm pretty sure, the bill points out not only the risks of actually deploying these deadly weapons, but also just the possibility of it happening by accident. And this kind of ties into what happened in Hawaii, where someone in the media pressed the wrong button, issuing a warning to the whole state there, and it was something that shouldn't have happened in the first place, but it did. But the same thing could happen when it comes to nuclear weapons, where there could be human error, where someone can make a mistake and set off one of these weapons there, not only resulting in great loss of life, but it could also result in more nuclear weapons going off at aggressive nations. And it kind of goes back to World War I, how just basically one shot started the entire war. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, if I have the name right. And once he and his wife were assassinated, then nations basically found themselves almost instantly at war because of secret alliances. So just one mistake on the part of a nuclear warhead could have some lasting and very costly consequences.
That's certainly the case. It's happened before when the weaponry wasn't in any way comparable to the weaponry we have now. A kind of humorous, gallows humor addition, when the governor of Hawaii was asked, why wasn't this alert canceled? Why was it left in place for 38 minutes? After some hemming and hawing, it turned out that he couldn't remember his password for his Twitter account.
Oh my goodness.
So, in all things human, we have the sublime, the fearful, and the comic somehow woven together. Now, in this first item, action requested, the last part of it says, making deeper cuts in nuclear arsenals. I'm looking now on the second page of this informational piece from the Conference of Bishops, and it refers to something called the New START Treaty. START, all caps again, refers to Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. And in 1991, the United States and the Soviet Union ratified this treaty. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means that after a time, it was re-ratified on April 8th, 2010. And these are statistics that I don't think any of us have at our fingertips, but it's nice to have them available. At any rate, this was ratified by the Senate, a bipartisan vote. This seems like the score of a runaway basketball game in high school. A solid bipartisan vote of 71 to 26. And the Holy See welcomed and recognized the ongoing successful implementation of this New START on the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. Well, what does it come to? a number of points, I'm sure, but here's something specific. It, quote, reduces deployed as in they're in place, strategic warheads to 1,550. Hate to think of what it was before that. So there are strategic warheads deployed. How many? 1,550. And that's 30% below the then existing ceiling. Limits both nations to no more than 700 delivery vehicles and includes new verification requirements. I think President Reagan is famous for a number of short statements. I love short statements, and one of them was trust but verify, and includes new verification requirements. Well, here we are, in virtue of a treaty that the Holy See was impressed with still 700 delivery vehicles. So the action requested includes making deeper cuts in nuclear arsenals. Well, that takes us to point 2. Oppose the investment of hundreds of billions of dollars in modernizing nuclear weapons systems that ultimately we must work to dismantle. Well, who is it that's talking about investing hundreds of billions of dollars in modernizing weapons systems? A great many people are talking about that. Towards the end of the Obama administration, there was a considerable amount of discussion on that. The president's position was one of concern, but wasn't about to say yay or nay. And now, 1 year into the Trump administration, we have forthcoming, and parts of it have been leaked already, something called the Nuclear Posture Review. Good grief, the acronym for that would be NPR, the Nuclear Posture Review. And it's going to include looking at a newer still start, which as of now has an expiration date in 2021. From what I've been able to see, the Nuclear Posture Review is strongly suggesting that we, in fact, take the nuclear arsenal as something that's here to stay, and that we make it more effective, and that we, as in so many other infrastructure issues, bring it up to date. And that will cost billions of dollars. Now, the Catholic Conference urges us to oppose that. Well, opposition to it in any effective way is going to involve more than, in some opinion poll, saying, I oppose that. Actual opposition would involve speaking with, writing to, contacting members of Congress and one's senators. And of course, here in California, the United States Conference of California Bishops does just that sort of thing on a range of issues. So I look to the Conference of the Bishops having action alerts in which we're encouraged to contact our political leaders. At the same time, I suspect the proverbial person in the pew, I gotta watch out with the alliteration, would be hard-pressed, this proverbial person in the pew, hard-pressed to say how many delivery vehicles we now have, or how many deployed strategic warheads we now have. So in order to be effective in this regard, we have to be educated. And I think one of our humble contributions here on the Open Door might be to get our listeners thinking and get ourselves thinking about just what's involved here. What do you think about the parishioners in the pew in Joliet? What might they say about such things?
Well, I would think that they're kind of at a crossroads, really, because it's kind of the question, how can you juggle keeping up national security while at the same time looking or promoting proliferation with nuclear warheads? And I think people here don't really think too much about the whole nuclear warheads and our nuclear arsenal. They just think I think they tend to leave that just to the experts and let the experts make the decisions and hope that it turns out okay. But yeah, I don't really know too much about the issue myself personally.
Well, we could do some thinking by way of analogy. I think a whole lot of Catholics have come to have a certain skepticism about letting decisions that affect basic moral posture, basic ethical response. I think a whole lot of Catholics are skeptical about leaving that to, say, lawyers, or leaving that to, say, boards of education, or leaving that, say, to the mayor. I think as we come to be in a more and more secularized society, the powers that be that actually represent that secular society, well, I think we are always interested in knowing what they have to say, always interested in treating them with a basic respect. I think at the same time, we need to hold them accountable and not just to assume that they're doing the right thing, or even that they know what the right thing to do would be. We have to, what does Scripture say? Test all things. Hold fast to that which is good. And that means, if nothing else, keeping our ears wide open, which takes us back to our panel, our show here, the open door. Now I'm going to go to the last point in this action requested list. It says, I'm sorry, it's the next to the last point. It says, if it is introduced, urge senators to support ratification. Urge senators to support ratification of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. Oh boy, another acronym. Sounds like a pesticide. CTBT. The Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. Now, at my parish, Saint John XXII in Inglewood, which has over 10,000 registered families as members, I think that if after Mass I were to go over to the coffee and donuts stand, dutifully staffed by either the Knights of Columbus or, on alternating weekends, the Catholic Daughters of America, and say something like, as a conversation starter, "Are these donuts really made out of tofu?" And then go on to, "What do you make of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty?" My "donuts made of tofu" remark would be laughed off as a bad joke told too often. But then the question about the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, I don't think anybody would have the faintest idea what it is. So let me give a little paragraph or so from our background document. It says, despite U.S. involvement in initiating the negotiations of what? Of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, in 1999, the U.S. Senate failed to ratify the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty that would stop nuclear testing. So, we have these weapons. What about just not testing anymore? What about that? Wouldn't that be a plausible next step? Well, the U.S. was involved in starting negotiations for that, but the Senate rejected the treaty. Senators who voted no expressed concerns about the ability of the United States to maintain its arsenal in the absence of testing. And others were concerned about verifying compliance with the treaty. Any answer to that? This informational piece says, prominent scientists have argued that the U.S. can safely maintain its nuclear arsenal without testing, and that the ability of the international community to verify compliance is amply demonstrated by detections of tests in North Korea. Well, 151 nations have ratified the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, including the United Kingdom, France, and Russia. But the United States has declined to do so. The Holy See, for its part, said, and this is just a quote of a sentence, "There's no reason for procrastination." So when is this CTBT, Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, going to be introduced again for consideration? No plans to do so. No plans to do so whatsoever. So we have the bishops saying that if it is reintroduced, we ought to urge senators to support its ratification. So we have this framework of reflection in the background. I can imagine it's being introduced, and what do they always talk about? News cycles being the center of attention for as long as 2 weeks, and then people who were paying attention will say something like, "Whatever happened to that?" And then after a month, we'll hear that it was stalled in committee or some such. Well, things are stalled in committee every bit as much as we're stalled on the freeways around here. But what the bishops are saying is, urge senators to support the ratification of the treaty. Now, one thing that's necessary for such urging is that the Catholics, the people in the proverbial pews, have some understanding of the issue and really believe that there ought to be such a test ban treaty. That, I think, would require lots and lots of discussion within the church and lots of leadership And it won't do to have attention deficit disorder with something like this. What do you make of that assessment, John?
Well, in one way, I kind of agree with the senators that voted no to the treaty, because they basically pointed out that what's the use of keeping a nuclear arsenal if we're not allowed to run tests on it and update it and whatnot. So it kind of boils down to, if we're going to chuck the water, then we have to chuck the baby that it washes, to use an analogy in the reverse sense. You got to throw the baby out with the bathwater in this sort of a way. And since the senators didn't want to they don't want to chuck the whole nuclear program, then it's kind of at a standstill.
I think looking at that specific concern, someone would have to read scientists on both sides of the question, which would take some work and would take a basic level of scientific education. And that's not easy either. Not easy at all. But I think you're right. We have to take seriously some, what we might say, very predictable and plausible objections. What the background piece here says is that prominent scientists have argued that testing isn't really necessary. I think to the man in the street, never mind in the pew, you have to do some work to convince people that something that's complicated doesn't need to be tested from time to time. Why would that be the case? Good point. Now we go on to the last item. I jumped the gun a little bit. We go on to the last item, which will require some more going back to the informational backgrounder. Last item 5, encourage Congress and the administration not to take any actions that could undermine the agreement between the, what's this? P5+1 and Iran. Aunt Molly, what's your take on the P5+1 and Iran? Aunt Molly says, ask Uncle Oscar. Okay, Uncle Oscar, what's your take on the P5+1 and Iran? Uncle Oscar says, never mind that, the dog needs to go for a walk. Your turn. Down home, that might be the conversation. All right, so let's go back to this informational piece. I'm maybe 12 lines from the bottom of the second page. P5+1 agreement with Iran. In recent years, serious questions were raised regarding Iran's nuclear program. In response, talk of military intervention increased, and crippling international sanctions were instituted to the detriment of Iran's economy and of its citizens. If memory serves, and it sometimes does, now I'm extrapolating, not so very long ago, I saw that if you're below 40, but eligible to be in the workforce, let's say over 18, there was something like 40% unemployment in Iran. Sanctions were instituted to the detriment of Iran's economy and its citizens. Following the election of Iranian President Rouhani, the United States, that's us, United Kingdom, Russia, China, Germany, and France, that gives us P5+1, entered into diplomatic negotiations with Iran regarding its nuclear program and international sanctions. All right. In July 2015, after 20 months of concerted collaboration, the P5+1 reached an agreement with Iran that aims to curb Iran's development of nuclear weapons while allowing for the use of nuclear energy for peaceful purposes. In September, a cloture vote, this is an aside, we're forever, especially in melodramatic TV shows, talking about coming to closure. This must be a neighbor of that. A cloture vote in the Senate that would have allowed rejection of the P5+1 deal failed, so the agreement stands. Recent Iranian launches of ballistic missiles, inconsistent with UN Security Council Resolution 2231, but not in violation of the P5+1 agreement, have raised concerns. In October 2017, 3 months ago, President Trump announced he would not certify to Congress that Iran was in compliance, despite U.S. and international evidence that Iran is observing the agreement. To date, Congress has not acted to undermine the agreement. Well, that's a little bit more than I think most people would be able to say about this. And what is the Conference of Bishops suggesting? Encourage Congress and the administration not to take any actions that could undermine the agreement between the P5+1 and Iran. Now, I don't think that anybody in the Conference of Catholic Bishops nationwide or the California Conference of Catholic Bishops takes this encourage Congress and the administration not to take any actions that could undermine the agreement as somehow central Catholic teaching. It's obviously what's called prudential. You have certain core ethical principles, and then you have a constantly shifting set of on-the-ground circumstances, and then you have prudential applications of timeless principles to shifting contingencies. On the other hand, here we have the Conference of Bishops that have certainly absorbed the principles, the central principles, have preached the central principles, have for the most part lived these principles, exercising their prudential judgment and saying that we ought to encourage this P5+1 agreement, at least until there's some significant change. The verification is taken to be of real importance. That's why the verification point is addressed in the background. Some people think that the verification tests haven't been met, but in fact the people who are in the position to rule on that have said otherwise.
Well, if I could interject real quick.
Sure. Anytime.
Wasn't this whole Iran nuclear situation, wasn't this something that Hillary Clinton was trying to run her campaign on, was that she solved the problem with Iran without firing a shot, quote unquote?
Well, if she could do it. I don't know how she could do it. But
isn't this what she was talking about, though, when she was campaigning on the trail there?
On the P5+1. Well, it could be that she supported that. I don't recall. We know that one player doesn't support it, and that's why we don't have P5+2. Israel certainly doesn't support it. And I suspect that Israel has a keen interest in what happens in Iran. And I suspect that Israel's intelligence is every bit as good as ours. On the other hand, the teaching of the church has always been try to live at peace with your neighbors. And the idea here is if in fact international verification teams have said that Iran is in compliance, then we ought not to reject the agreement that took a long time to achieve. But again, I would say this is prudential. Now, let me stir the pot here in a big way. What's not mentioned in this background document, and what digs much more deeply than the action requested items, the half-dozen actions requested, is that within, is it a month now, maybe 6 weeks, I'd say closer to a month, within the last month or 6 weeks, Pope Francis has said in an international forum, mind you, not in encyclical, not suggesting a development within the Catechism of the Catholic Church, but he has said expressly that not only the use of nuclear weapons is wrong, but the possession of nuclear weapons is wrong. He didn't say the possession of nuclear weapons is risky. That goes without saying. Driving on the 405 is risky. Some people say getting out of bed is risky, but surely it's not wrong. It's not even wrong to drive on the 405 if you're a good driver. But he has said even the possession of nuclear weapons is wrong. Now, the moral argument that he would be using isn't hard to figure out. It would go something like this. Premise 1, it is always wrong intentionally to kill the innocent. It is always wrong intentionally to kill the innocent. Think abortion. It is always wrong intentionally to kill the innocent. Premise 2, the use of nuclear weapons, which by their nature are indiscriminate, would intentionally kill innocent people. Conclusion, the use of nuclear weapons is wrong. Now, next argument. We'll call this premise 1 primed. It is always wrong to seriously threaten to do what is intrinsically wrong. I didn't rape her, I just threatened to rape her. Sorry. It's always wrong to threaten to do that which is always wrong, intrinsically wrong. But the maintenance of a nuclear deterrence, this is the next premise, this would be premise 2 starred, is always, the maintenance of nuclear deterrence is always a threat to do something that's intrinsically wrong. Conclusion, it's wrong to maintain a nuclear deterrence. Now, one quick response to that would be, I think, we're just bluffing. But it's just a bluff response doesn't work because we don't say, as a matter of policy, to all the young men and women who are in charge of maintaining the nuclear arsenals and even in charge of deploying them if necessary and putting them in flight if necessary, we don't say to them, we're having an in-service this weekend. Get to the in-service. Hey, everybody, this is just a bluff, but don't let on. We're asking them to commit themselves to a policy that doesn't involve any kind of a bluff at all. So it would seem to me that the Pope has a very strong argument. And, well, if you were to share that argument with the proverbial people in the pew, I suspect some gentle souls would agree, but I suspect the majority would say, no, we can't do that, we can't do that. We can't do that, we can't do that. We have to have that deterrence. So I think what we have here is, no surprise, a moral crisis, and it's certainly not the only moral crisis that we have, but it's one that I think is often ignored. Thoughts on that, John?
Yeah, well, I was just thinking, a couple weeks ago, Pope Francis was on the plane on his way to Chile for his apostolic visit there, and as usual, he has a press conference on the plane, with all the reporters and such. And one of the things that he did before concluding that interview was that he passed around a holy card, or not necessarily a holy card, but a card, and on the front was a picture of one of the victims from the nuclear attacks in Nagasaki way back when.
Yes.
This little boy, and on his back was the body of his young brother. And he was basically just waiting in line to the crematorium. And on the back, Pope Francis wrote simply the effects of war. People like to associate, a child carrying another child on his back with Father Flanagan with Boy's Son, if I'm not wrong.
Yes,
or, saying,
yes.
I've had to keep my brother.
Right, he ain't have a father, he's my brother.
But just this picture of something that's real, something that happened even way back when, it still has lasting consequence, and it should be a very stark reminder to each of us that, discussing nuclear warheads, we're not talking about something light here. This is something very, very grave. So that picture, picture speaks 1,000 words, but I think that picture spoke a lot more, really.
Yes, that's certainly eloquent. I saw a picture not so long ago, like 3-4 days ago, that was in a collection of pictures taken, some of them 50 years ago, some of them 70 years ago, some of them still older. One picture was especially noteworthy given our topic. If I've got my dates right, in 1952, the Boston Marathon was won by a young man from Japan who had been enough on the outskirts of Nagasaki not to have been affected by the atomic bomb that was dropped there. And the caption underneath said that when so-and-so crossed the finish line, the crowd was silent. It didn't say anything more than that. But it's as if there's a certain resilience of the human spirit, and one response to that resilience would be a deep, respectful, admiring silence. Another connection with the bombing in Japan is that Father Pedro Arrupe went on to become the superior general of the Jesuit order, was stationed at that time outside of Nagasaki, far enough outside so that he could observe from a distance the explosion, but he himself was spared any harm. And fast forward, when Father Daniel Berrigan, S.J., was in prison, one of the times he was in prison, Father Berrigan was an adamant opponent of the use of the military in international contexts. Father Arupe went out of his way to come to visit him, which I think left many people wondering, well, now, why did he do that? Did he go to visit him to tell him to cut it out and to get out of the Jesuits? Or I suspect when he went to visit Berrigan, he might have had in mind his first-hand observation of what it is to see a nuclear weapon, atomic weapon at that time, exploded. Well, how to talk about these things? It just so happens that today, New York Times, a paper I read only because my brother subscribes to it, a paper that I read only to keep tab on certain things, but a paper I sometimes read because it has a big budget, it has some things you wouldn't otherwise see in it. The New York Times, in the front section, it's true, it's page 9 of the front section, but still the front section, today has a picture, and it's a picture that I've seen off and on. I remember seeing it since the 1960s. It's a picture put together by the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. And it's a picture that shows a clock. And the long hand of the clock is approaching the end of the hour. And what hour? The shorthand is pointing to 12. And here's the first paragraph of the piece on this clock picture. The doomsday clock, a potent symbol of scientific concerns about humanity's possible annihilation, was advanced by 30 seconds on Thursday to 2 minutes to midnight. The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists announced in Washington. The last time the clock was moved so close to midnight was in 1953, during the Cold War. And the article goes on to give an account of all the factors that this group of scientists considered in making this decision, very symbolic decision, but an eloquent symbol, to move the second hand up to 2 minutes for midnight. One little chunk of that analysis. It cited the risks from North Korea's nuclear program, discord between Russia and the United States, tensions in the South China Sea, the buildup of the nuclear arsenals of Pakistan and India, and were we just talking about this? Uncertainty over the Iran nuclear deal. Well, how's someone to respond to this, John? What do we say?
I think it raises some questions as to whether, the whole idea of peace through force is really a valid theory. Whether it's really in line with Catholic teaching and whether it's really worth pursuing.
And among your friends, if you wanted to raise this question, how might you do so?
I would probably just simply ask, do you really think that peace can be achieved through the threat of war? Because if that's what they think, then how is that even a logical conclusion? And if this isn't logical, what are we doing to remedy the situation? If we're not doing anything about it, then we're going to be stuck with whatever our elected officials vote on, basically. I think Abraham Lincoln had a saying that if people don't put out the fire themselves, then and just prefer to sit, then they can go ahead and sit on their blisters then. That's kind of what I'm afraid that we may end up doing in the future.
Yes, I think one of the things is to somehow act with giving people this information, with calling their attention to the arguments that come into play, calling their attention to what the Holy Father has just so recently said. And there's a couple of other points that are in this article that might be useful for us. The scientists who made this gesture, among the list of things that they call our attention to, cited the hacking of computer systems that control financial and energy infrastructure. And I know that that's mentioned in the National Nuclear Posture Review that's about to be released. The hacking of computer systems that control financial and energy infrastructure, the development of autonomous weaponry that can make kill decisions without human supervision, and the possible misuse of synthetic biology. Now, one of the items there that a number of Catholics have called attention to, and seems far, far afield from our discussion today, is the revolutionary CRISPR Cas9 gene editing tool. It is now possible to do genetic editing of human beings in utero. And there are legal restrictions in place, but it's predictable, I think, that these legal restrictions will one by one fall away. So with genetic editing, we have a further power over the coming to be of human life, and there's a kind of mirror image of that. We have a greater and greater control over the ending of human life on a mass scale with incredibly complex machinery. Now, at the end of this article, well, not the end, but the last quarter of the article, critics of this doomsday clock are cited. And one of them, I think, makes a good observation. He says it's really hard to compare in an absolute sense today to 1953, the last time the clock was set 2 minutes before the end of the day and everything else. And I think that's right. This is a judgment call. But now, here's a response to that. From a defender, people can say it's a scam, but the point of this is to encourage public discussion. What you're trying to do is to get people to act. The clock, its defender says, captures for one day deep existential threats that for most of the rest of the year aren't talked about. That seems right. It seems very definitely right. Well, if you want to add to that, John, please do. If you're wanting to think it over, I could give a brief update on what Pelican, that is to say American Solidarity Party thinkers, who are actors, who are running for office, are up to here in Southern California, keeping in mind that the platform which we worked through plank by plank some time ago. The platform of the American Solidarity Party is committed to what's called pro-life for the whole of life, committed to the sanctity of human life, and committed to a rigorous application of just war criteria, treating them as if they really mattered rather than as if they were rubber bands to pull as far as possible. Here's an update. Our candidate for governor, Desmond Silvera, has said that he has enough signatures, not to mention money in his piggy bank. He is, as my father used to say, gainfully employed. He's a software engineer. He has what he needs to be on the ballot. There's no question of that now. Interesting statistic here. How many people have filed? Not how many people have gathered what's necessary for their name to actually be on the ballot, but how many people have said, yes, I am running for governor in California? John, you got to just take a guess.
I'd probably say around 12, maybe.
Try 67.
Holy mackerel.
So this is California. And there's just this one-party state here in California. It's the Democratic Party. And anybody who knows much about this at all expects that the top two names that are on the final ballot, not the primary ballot, will be the names of two Democrats. That's the way things work. But we start off, it's like a marathon, John. Start off with a lot of people at the beginning, 67. And we're certainly going to make it to the get your name on the ballot for the primary. And we have our regular visitor, Ed Rushman, who's also set to run for a congressional district in Orange County. That's a go. The more signatures, the better, the less the filing fee is. But it's a go. And we have another go, and he just declared that he's the sort of fellow who doesn't do that much on Facebook, but does all sorts of things and does them by the book and is very organized. A fellow who looks to me to be about maybe 30, and he's running for city council in San Diego. And I'd hoped that he'd be with us today. Maybe we'll get him on next week. I only gave him a day's warning because I only knew he was running for 2 days. But I think San Diego City Council is a lot more feasible than governor of the state of California. Of course, at this stage, what we're trying to do is to get ourselves known. And sooner or later, somebody's going to have to win something. So that's where we are on that front. Well, we're coming now to the end of our show. So I want to say thank you again, John. You're our most regular participant, and you always give us a fresh perspective. And I want to say thank you to our listeners. We know that there are listeners. Our producer par excellence, Sebastian Mahfoud, OP, he's a third-order Dominican, even has a ratings list for the various shows that Encore Media and Books sponsors. There are about 20 such shows. And of late, we've been in the top 3 or 4. So we know that there are listeners. And remember, too, all of these shows are archived, so they can be checked out. And if you go to the listings for the station, you also have archived the agendas for each and every week. And you can take a look at those agendas, and very often they're pretty full documents that we begin our discussions with. So on that note, I'm going to end with two prayers. One, decidedly Roman Catholic in inspiration, although scriptural in foundation, and the other short but close to my heart. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
The people who have been in darkness have seen a great light. Come, Lord Jesus, come. Thank you. Good morning.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.